Welcome to episode 2 of Faith and Art, and this episode is called Christ in Majesty. So I'm going to show you one of my favorite images drawn from the repertoire of Christian art, and also one of my favorite types of image, and this will be an image of Christ in majesty, Christ in glory, Christ seated at the right hand of the Father. And personally, I find this one of the most potent and fascinating kind of images that we have. And I think it gives us, in some ways, in a very kind of concentrated form, the whole of our faith kind of summed up in one image for us. So the purpose of these talks, these meditations, is to kind of let the images from the repertoire of Christian art kind of live in our consciousness, to bring them alive again so that they might kind of inform and deepen our faith in this time of crisis, might bring us a word of comfort, a word of encouragement, or a word of hope. Now, what I'm going to argue in this lecture is that this image is a visual attempt to convey one of the essential truths of our Christian faith. It's part of our faith that Christ is seated at the right hand of the Father. If you think about the Creed, for example, the very still heart of the Creed is the confession that Christ sits at the right hand of the Father. And this truth is found abundantly also in the sacred scriptures. And it's my kind of belief that this is the mystery of Christ's life that we are living through in this present time, the time of the church, the time after the ascension of Christ into heaven, and where he sat down at the right hand of the Father. So we kind of meditate in our Christian faith, we kind of meditate on and think about, try and commemorate the mysteries of Christ's life. So, for example, in Passion Week and Easter, we'll recall the mystery of his passion, his suffering, his death, his burial, his resurrection. And all those are kind of mysteries of his life. Events that are kind of potent with meaning and significance for us. But if we ask, where is Christ right now? The answer to this is that he is seated at the right hand of the Father in glory. So the image that I'm going to show you, and I'll show it to you in a minute, is attempt to represent this truth for us in visual terms, but also within the limits of visuality. And that's a distinction that I'll return to later on in the talk. So I think now probably the best thing for me to do is to show you the image and let you gaze upon it for a few seconds. And this is an image that I actually have on my wall that I gaze at frequently, and which never ceases to kind of fill me with a kind of sense of awe. So here is the image. I'll try and get a good depiction of it for you. Now, several features of this image are noteworthy. So this is, first of all, it's an ivory plaque. That's the material of it. And it was found somewhere in the British Isles, and is considered to be an example of Anglo-Saxon art, and it dates from about the mid-11th century. Now, it's an ivory relief carving, but it's not ivory from an elephant, rather it's ivory from the tusk of a walrus. So I suspect it was easy to find a walrus on the shores of the British Isles, easier to find that than it was to find an elephant roaming around somewhere there. So this is then an ivory carving from the mid-11th century, found near Kent, England. Strangely, it was found by a boxer as he was digging for something else. The central image then, of course, is the image of Christ. And you'll notice that he has a cruciform halo, a halo with the cruciform inscribed in it. In his left hand, he holds a book, which is the book of the Gospels, and with his right hand, he blesses us. So I'd like to kind of think about the significance of several of the features of this image. So first of all, Christ is surrounded by a mandorla. He's encased in this kind of almond-shaped form, like this. And originally that mandorla was painted with bright paint and gold leaf to mark it as a kind of precious space. So we might think, first of all, about the significance of the mandorla. And this is something that kind of scholars debate and wonder about. And like many elements of Christian art, it can have different meanings depending on the context in which it is found. But in my view, I think the mandorla represents a kind of opening of the heavens. So you can imagine the heavens as a kind of vault, and suddenly there is a kind of opening in that vault, an opening in heavens, into the heavens, to allow us to grasp what is on the other side, what is in the kind of divine realm. So what the mandorla represents is an opening. It's a kind of event in which we live in our imagination, of course, because we're in the realm of images, but it's a kind of event in which the heavens are open for us and we can see what is in the heavens. And we see here Christ sitting at the right hand of the Father. We see here one of the essential truths, one of the essential realities of our faith. So the mandorla then is an opening. The mandorla is an event. Now, I argued that this is an image of Christ seated at the right hand of the Father. And you might ask, well, where is the Father? And where is the Father's right hand? And I think there's kind of two answers I would give to this, that Christ sits at the right hand of the Father, but it's very difficult for us to think, let alone to imagine, what it's like to sit at the right hand of the Father. The Father is forever invisible. He is the first person of the Blessed Trinity, whereas Christ himself became incarnate. He is the Word made flesh, and so we can picture him, we can imagine him, we can depict him, but the Father is forever invisible. So I think one reason the Father is absent, simply because this is not something that really can be depicted for us in visual terms. It's kind of too mysterious, it's too strange, it's something we can only think about. It surpasses the limits of our imagination. Although, having said that, there are certain earlier images of Christ in majesty. I'm thinking of the one that was found in the original St. Peter's, made in maybe the 360s or so, where Christ is seated on a glorious jeweled throne, and the right hand of the Father comes down out of the heavens above him to bless him. So this is Christ seated at the right hand of the Father. The Father is absent precisely because it's too difficult to portray in visual terms. But there might be another reason here, and even, I think, a deeper theological reason. In the letter to the Colossians, we learn that Christ is the image of the unseen God. Christ is the image of the unseen God. He is the one who makes known to us, who kind of images for us the reality of the unseen God. And even there's a text here from the letter to the Hebrews that says that Christ reflects the glory of God and bears the very stamp of his nature, upholding the universe by his word of power. So Christ then is the image of the Father. He bears the very stamp of his nature. And there's an episode told us in the Gospel of St. John. The Apostle Philip says to Jesus, show us the Father, and we shall be satisfied. And Jesus says to Philip, Philip, have I been with you so long? Jesus says, he who has seen me has seen the Father. So to see Christ then is in some mysterious but direct way to see the Father. So when we behold this image of Christ, the Father is not absent. The Father is present for us in the image of Christ. And that's the kind of theological mystery that we could think about for a long time, that Jesus, in his kind of self-giving love, shows forth for us the very nature of God the Father. So in him, in his life, in his activity, in his will, we see the kind of deepest nature of the Father unfolding for us in a way we can think and grasp and imagine. So an image then, I would argue, of Christ seated at the right hand of the Father, Christ where he is right now. Now let's look again at some other details of this image. You'll notice that Christ is seated, and he is seated on a kind of bow, and that his feet rest on a kind of footstool. And this references a line from one of the Psalms. I can't remember which one. Earth is my footstool, and heaven is my throne. So here Christ sits upon the heavens themselves become his throne, and the earth is his footstool. And significantly, this tells us, I think, that Christ is both in heaven, but also on earth. His feet touch the earth. And this means that although Christ has ascended into heaven to be seated at the right hand of the Father, that he hasn't left us, that his feet, his life, his activity, his presence are at work on this earth and everywhere on this earth. And this tells us, I think, that Christ sits at the right hand of the Father, not in the mode of abandonment or leaving us, but it's a new and a different way of being present to us on the earth. And you'll notice also that Christ, well, let me just comment a bit on the kind of style of this image. So when you look at this image, you might see it as a little bit crude, a little bit roughly carved. So you can see the kind of face of Christ is just barely kind of sketched. And I think a couple things we can say about this. That first of all, the body of Christ is portrayed in a very kind of abstract, kind of schematic kind of way. It's not a kind of realistic depiction of Christ, but is all a kind of an abstract depiction. You can see like the knees of Christ are kind of strange ovals. You can see the various kind of lines drawn to indicate the garments. You can see the fingers of Christ are, too large for this kind of image. And I think that this kind of formal considerations place this in the kind of Romanesque tradition. The Romanesque was a style of art that existed in more or less Western Europe in the kind of 11th and the 12th century. And in Romanesque art, the human form was depicted in this very kind of stylized, very kind of abstract, very kind of schematic way. There wasn't an attempt there to make the human body look realistic in the way that Greek and Roman artists had done, and in a way that would be revived later on in the Gothic period and the Renaissance. And the human body was portrayed in this way, deliberately. There wasn't an attempt to make the human body look realistic. And Romanesque art, Romanesque sculpture, at its best, can be very kind of potent, The artists had a very kind of refined sensibility, and were able to convey a kind of deep kind of inner life in the figures that it carves, and it's especially true in the kind of Romanesque artists operative in France at the time. So this would probably be considered a piece of Romanesque art, simply because of the way that the human form, the picture of Christ is kind of figured. Now, it's probably the case that this artist was not the most skilled artist. You don't get the refinement and the expressiveness that you get in Romanesque art as it existed in other places. So there is something kind of a little bit kind of crude about this image, but at the same time that it's a theologically very kind of sophisticated image. And so the craftsman was either the craftsman himself had a very kind of fine and finely attuned theological mind, or he was directed in his making by someone, maybe a bishop, maybe a kind of monk, maybe a kind of abbot, who knows, was directed by some such person with such a mind in kind of crafting this work for us. So some other kind of features of this image. Christ holds in his left hand the book of the Gospels, and with his right hand he blesses us. So we can ask, first of all, where this image was originally located. And most probably it was on the cover of a gospel book. And it probably would have been one piece of an ensemble of images. Probably around this image of Christ in Majesty, there would have been 4 other ivory panels, carvings of the symbols of the 4 evangelists, who would be looking in upon and contemplating the figure of Christ. And later on, perhaps another episode, I'll show you such images. So in this image, then this is found on the cover of a gospel book, and Christ holds in his left hand a book of the Gospels, and the book of the Gospels that he holds is kind of closed. So what this image is then is an invitation to the person who looks upon it to open the book of the Gospels and to find there all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge that are hidden within Christ. So the image then invites the opening and the reading and the meditating upon the book of the Gospels. And significantly, I think Jesus holds the gospel book close to himself. It's entirely kind of within the Mandorla, and that, I think, is that the essential truths of the gospel tells us that the essential truths of the Gospels themselves, they tell us about what Christ did, they tell us about his deeds, they tell us his miracles, they tell us about the various healings that he did. They relate the story of his passion, death, and resurrection and ascension into heaven. But all those events are kind of unfolded for us so that we might find our way to the Christ who exists in heaven. So in a strange kind of way, the Gospels, although they're about the past, the Gospels are in heaven, that they are an invitation to us to find, to contemplate, to live in the sight of Christ who exists in heaven for us. But in this image, you see the gospel. Jesus holds the gospel book close to himself, but with his right hand he blesses us, and the fingers of that hand are exaggerated, and they kind of move outside of the Mandorla. And what that means is that although the gospel books are in heaven and leading us to heaven, nevertheless the blessings of the gospel books are available to us on earth. That right hand of Christ leaves the space of the Mandorla and enters into our space to bless us. And the hands are exaggerated, I think, to emphasize and to indicate the reality and the importance of this blessing. So, so to sum up then, this is an attempt to convey in visual terms and within the limits of visuality an essential truth of our faith, namely to show us visually where Christ is right now. And so it's an image showing us where Christ is right now. And perhaps just to conclude and to draw a kind of word of comfort, word of inspiration from this, well, Christ is... Actually, let me just do one other thing, that this would have been on the cover of a gospel book, okay? But that gospel book probably wouldn't have been a kind of private possession of a monk or a priest or a kind of a nun or an abbess or whatever, but it would have been a liturgical book. It would have been carried in procession in the liturgy. It would have been incensed as a kind of precious and holy item, and it would have been opened in the context of the church, where the words of the gospel would be proclaimed in the midst of the liturgy. That it is in the liturgy, it's in the church that the gospel finds its kind of true home, its true expression, where it's able to kind of unfold and live and breathe and bless us. And even though that's true, there's always been a tradition in the scripture of each one of us picking the Bible up for ourselves and reading it and meditating upon it, which I think is especially important in the present time. This Lent is giving most Catholics a kind of fast from the liturgy, a kind of fast from the Mass. Many of you are, faithful Mass goers every Sunday. Some of you have go to Mass every single day of your life as a kind of central act of your day. And I'm sure it's very difficult to be deprived of this. It's a beautiful thing to hear the Gospels read in church, to hear the Gospels proclaimed and preached upon. But I think we can also, for ourselves, kind of develop a kind of habit of reading, habit of kind of meditation, habit of kind of contemplation. Christ speaks to us in the Gospels. Christ is there for us. All the treasures of his wisdom and knowledge are hidden there for us. Then the final point is that Christ is at the right hand of the Father, but he is there to hear us. He is there to kind of bless us. He is there so that we can find him. And I'll just conclude the very beautiful passage again from the letter to the Hebrews. Let me just find this passage. It's Hebrews chapter 4, verse 3, which I had marked here and I can't find it. So Hebrews comes. Where does Hebrews come? Hebrews chapter 4, verse 14. Since we have a great high priest who has passed through the heavens, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold fast to our confession. For we have not a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but one who in every respect has been tempted as we are, yet without sinning. And here is the word I think that we need to hear. Let us then with confidence draw near the throne of grace, that we may receive mercy and find grace to help in time of need.